Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight I am bringing you 10 of the most disturbing true horror stories ever to emerge from the frozen wilderness of Canada's Yukon territory. From creatures that hunt in the endless winter darkness to disappearances that defy all logic. From ancient curses awakened by greed to entities that have stalked these northern lands for generations. These accounts come from the people who survived encounters they still cannot explain. These are not legends passed down through time. These are real experiences from trappers, researchers, travelers, and residents who faced something in the Yukon that changed them forever. The far north keeps its secrets well, but tonight we are pulling back the veil on the terror that waits in the land where the aurora dances, and civilization is nothing but a distant memory. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Yukon wilderness, where temperatures drop to 40 below, where the winter sun abandons you for months, and where something ancient and hungry watches from the tree line, waiting for you to make one fatal mistake. I am a 29-year-old wildlife monitoring technician, and what I am about to tell you happened in November of last year near Dawson City in the Yukon Territory. I have worked in remote wilderness for 6 years now, and I have always considered myself a rational person. I have a degree in biology. I understand animal behavior. I do not believe in monsters or cryptids or any of that nonsense you see on those late-night television shows. But after what I experienced during those 3 weeks in the darkness of the Yukon winter, I am not so sure about anything anymore. The job seemed straightforward enough when I accepted it. The territorial government needed someone to monitor wildlife activity along a 40-kilometer stretch of the Klondike River Valley during the early winter months. They were studying how caribou and moose populations were adapting to changing migration patterns, and they needed someone to check trail cameras, document tracks, and collect data on predator activity in the area. The pay was excellent, and I would be living in a small research cabin that had been used by field biologists for decades. It sat about 15 kilometers from the nearest road, accessible only by snowmobile, and the nearest town was Dawson City, roughly 30 kilometers to the northwest. I would be alone out there, but that did not bother me. I had done solo fieldwork before, and I actually preferred the solitude. I arrived at the cabin on November 8th, just as the days were getting seriously short. By mid-November, in that part of the Yukon, you are looking at maybe 4 or 5 hours of weak daylight, and the sun barely clears the horizon. The rest of the time, you are living in twilight or complete darkness. The cabin itself was small but well maintained. It had a wood stove, a propane heater for backup, solar panels with a battery bank, and a satellite communication system for emergencies. There was a small kitchen area, a bunk, and a work table where I could process my data. The windows faced east and south, looking out over a small clearing and then dense spruce forest beyond. It was isolated, yes, but it was also peaceful in a way that is hard to describe to people who have never experienced true wilderness. The first week went exactly as planned. I would wake up before dawn, eat breakfast, and then head out on the snowmobile to check the network of trail cameras I had set up along game trails and near water sources. The cameras were motion activated and would capture photos and short video clips of whatever passed by. I documented tracks, collected scat samples, and noted any unusual activity. The data was routine: moose, caribou, a few wolves, some foxes, the occasional lynx. Everything you would expect to find in that environment. The nights were cold, often dropping to minus 30 Celsius, but the cabin stayed warm, and I spent my evenings organizing data and reading by lamplight. It was exactly the kind of work I loved, but on the 8th night, something changed. I was sitting at the work table around 9 p.m. going through photos from one of the cameras near the river when I came across an image that made me stop. The camera had triggered at 3:47 a.m. the previous night, and the photo showed the clearing in front of the lens, illuminated by the camera's infrared flash. But in the background between two spruce trees, there was something standing upright. At first, I thought it might be a moose or a person, but when I zoomed in on my laptop, I realized it was neither. The figure was tall, extremely tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, and it appeared to be bipedal. Its proportions were wrong for a human. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, and the way it stood seemed awkward, almost like it was leaning forward slightly. The infrared flash had caught what looked like pale skin or fur, and there were 2 points of light where eyes should be, reflecting back at the camera. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or a double exposure, some kind of technical glitch. I had seen plenty of strange artifacts in trail camera photos before, but when I checked the next image in the sequence, taken 2 seconds later, the figure had moved. It was closer to the camera now, and the angle was different. You could see more detail. The head was elongated, almost skull-like, and the arms hung down past where the knees would be. The third image in the sequence showed nothing. Whatever it was had moved out of frame or disappeared entirely. I went back through all the other cameras from that night, and I found similar images on 2 more cameras, both within a 5-kilometer radius. The same figure, or something very similar, appeared in the background of photos taken between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. It was always at a distance, always partially obscured by trees, but it was there. I felt my stomach tighten as I looked at the images. This was not a glitch. This was something that had been moving through the forest that night, and it had triggered multiple cameras across a wide area. I did not sleep well that night. I kept the lights on in the cabin and sat with my back to the wall, listening to every sound outside. The wind moved through the spruce trees with a low whistling sound, and the cabin creaked as the temperature dropped. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was a rational explanation for what I had seen. Maybe it was another researcher in the area, someone I did not know about. Maybe it was a bear walking upright, though that did not explain the proportions or the height. By morning, I'd convinced myself that I needed to go back out and check the cameras in person to see if there were tracks or any other physical evidence. I found the tracks 2 days later near the camera that had captured the clearest image. The snow was hard-packed and icy, but there were impressions leading away from the trail into the deeper forest. They were not animal tracks. They were shaped like human footprints, but they were massive, at least 18 inches long and proportionally narrow. The stride length was impossible. Each step covered more than 6 feet of ground, far more than any human could manage, even running. I followed the tracks for about 200 meters before they disappeared into an area of rocky ground where the snow had been blown clear. I took photos and measurements, but I did not follow any further. Something about being out there alone, following those tracks deeper into the forest, filled me with a sense of dread I could not shake. That night, I heard it for the first time. I was lying in my bunk around midnight when I heard a sound outside the cabin. It started as a low scraping, like something dragging across the wooden exterior wall. Then it stopped, and there was silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then the scraping started again, this time on the other side of the cabin. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The scraping moved along the wall, slow and deliberate, and then it stopped at the window near the door. I could hear breathing. It was deep and raspy, and it sounded too close, like whatever was out there had its face pressed against the glass. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it at the window, but the light just reflected back at me. I could not see anything outside. The breathing stopped, and then I heard footsteps crunching in the snow, moving away from the cabin and into the trees. I did not go outside. I sat there for the rest of the night with my flashlight and my satellite phone, ready to call for help if whatever it was came back. But it did not. When the sun finally rose, I went outside and checked the perimeter of the cabin. There were tracks in the snow, the same massive footprints I had found near the camera. They circled the entire cabin, sometimes coming within a few feet of the walls, and then they led off into the forest to the south. I should have called for an extraction right then. I should have reported what I was seeing and let someone else deal with it. But part of me was still convinced there had to be an explanation, and part of me was afraid of what people would think if I came back with stories about a giant creature stalking me in the woods. So I stayed. And that was a mistake. The encounters continued. Almost every night, I would hear the scraping on the walls, the breathing at the windows, the footsteps circling the cabin. I started keeping a fire going in the wood stove all night, and I slept with my boots on and my gear packed, ready to run if I had to. During the day, I would find more tracks, more evidence that something was out there watching me. The trail cameras captured it again and again, always at night, always moving through the forest, just beyond the edge of the clearings. And then, on the 19th night, I saw it face to face. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of something moving on the roof of the cabin. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and slow, walking from one end to the other. I lay there frozen, listening as whatever it was paced back and forth above me. Then it stopped, and there was a long silence. I heard a creaking sound, and then suddenly there was a face at the window next to my bunk. I will never forget what I saw. It was pale, almost white, with skin that looked stretched too tight over the bones. The eyes were black, completely black, and they reflected the faint light from the stove like an animal's eyes. The mouth hung open slightly, and I could see teeth, too many teeth, all uneven and sharp. It stared at me through the glass, and I stared back, unable to move, unable to breathe. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Then, without any sound or warning, it was gone, just vanished from the window. I called for extraction the next morning. I told them I was sick, that I needed to leave immediately for medical reasons. They sent a helicopter, and I was out of there by noon. I left most of my gear behind. I did not care. I just wanted to be away from that place. When I got back to Dawson City, I filed my report and turned in my data. I mentioned the unusual tracks and the trail camera images, but I did not mention the encounters at the cabin. I did not mention the thing I saw at the window. They reviewed my data and thanked me for my work, and they sent another technician to replace me. That technician lasted 4 days before he called for extraction. He reported the same things I had experienced: the tracks, the sounds at night, the feeling of being watched. The government shut down the monitoring program at that location and moved it to a different area. They claimed it was due to budget concerns, but I know better. I do not work in the Yukon anymore. I took a job down south, doing survey work in areas with roads and towns and other people nearby. I still have the photos from the trail cameras, and I still have the measurements I took of those tracks. I have shown them to colleagues, and no one can explain them. Some people tell me it was a bear. Some people tell me I was hallucinating from isolation and cold. But I know what I saw. I know what was out there in those woods, circling my cabin every night, watching me through the windows. And I know it is still out there, waiting for the next person to come stumbling into its territory. I do not know what it was. I do not have a name for it, but I know it was real, and I know I will never go back to that part of the Yukon again. Some places are not meant for us. Some places belong to things we do not understand and should not disturb. I learned that the hard way, and I carry that knowledge with me every single day. Whatever lives in those frozen forests near Dawson City, it does not want us there, and we should listen. I'm 32 years old, and I never thought I would be the kind of person who believed in ghosts. I've always been practical, grounded, the type who needs to see evidence before accepting anything as truth. But what happened to me last fall in Carcross, Yukon, changed everything I thought I knew about the world. My grandmother passed away in September, and she left me her cabin. It was a place I had visited only twice as a child, and I barely remembered it. But when the estate lawyer contacted me and explained that I was the sole heir to the property, I decided I needed to go up there and figure out what to do with it. The cabin was built in 1903, during the tail end of the Klondike Gold Rush era. It sat on the outskirts of Carcross, a tiny community that once served as a stopping point for prospectors making their way to Dawson City. The building itself was a 2-story log structure with a peaked roof and a small front porch that overlooked Bennett Lake. It was beautiful in a weathered, forgotten kind of way. The paint was peeling, the wood was gray with age, and the windows were cloudy with decades of dust. But there was something about it that felt important, like it held stories that needed to be remembered. My partner James and I made the trip in late September. We drove up from Vancouver, which took us 3 days. The plan was to spend 2 weeks at the cabin, sorting through my grandmother's belongings, deciding what to keep and what to sell, and ultimately making arrangements to put the property on the market. Neither of us had any intention of keeping it. We both had jobs and lives in the city, and the idea of maintaining a remote property in the Yukon seemed impractical. But from the moment we arrived, I felt a pull toward the place that I could not explain. It was like the cabin wanted me there. The first night was uneventful. We unpacked our things, started a fire in the old wood stove, and made dinner in the small kitchen. The cabin had electricity, but it was powered by an old generator that my grandmother had apparently maintained herself. The place smelled like aged wood and dust, with a faint underlying scent of something floral that I could not identify. James joked that it smelled like an old lady's perfume, and we both laughed. But that night, as I lay in the upstairs bedroom that had once been my grandmother's, I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were slow and deliberate, the kind of footsteps that come from someone who knows exactly where they're going. I assumed it was James coming up to bed, but when I called out to him, he answered from downstairs. He had not moved. The footsteps stopped halfway up the stairs, and then there was nothing. I got out of bed and looked down the staircase, but I could see nothing in the darkness. I told myself it was just the house settling, that old buildings made sounds like that all the time. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. Those were not random creaks. Those were footsteps. Over the next few days, the occurrences became more frequent and harder to ignore. Doors would close on their own, even when there was no breeze. We would leave a room with the door wide open, and when we came back minutes later, it would be shut. James found it unsettling, but he kept insisting there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the floors were uneven, causing the doors to swing closed. Maybe there were drafts we had not noticed. I wanted to believe him, but I was starting to feel like we were not alone in that cabin. On the 4th night, I found my grandmother's journal. It was tucked away in a trunk in the attic, along with old photographs, letters, and other personal items. The journal was leather-bound and filled with entries dating back to the 1970s, when my grandmother had first moved to the cabin after my grandfather died. I started reading through it, and what I found made my blood run cold. She wrote about strange things happening in the house, doors opening and closing, cold spots that would appear in the middle of rooms, the sound of someone walking through the house at night. And then, buried in an entry from 1982, she wrote something that made me stop breathing. She wrote that she had been keeping something contained in the basement, that there was a presence in the house that had been there long before she arrived, and that as long as she performed certain rituals, it would stay quiet. I showed the journal to James, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. We had not been down to the basement yet. The door was at the back of the kitchen, and it had been locked since we arrived. My grandmother had left the key on a hook by the door, but neither of us had felt any reason to go down there. Now we both stared at that locked door and wondered what was waiting on the other side. That night, we saw her. We were sitting in the living room, trying to distract ourselves by watching a movie on James's laptop, when the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. It was like someone had opened a freezer door. Our breath came out in visible clouds, and I could see frost forming on the inside of the windows. James reached for my hand, and we both looked toward the stairs. There, standing at the top of the staircase, was the figure of a woman. She was wearing a long dress from another era, something Victorian or Edwardian, and her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark and hollow. She stared down at us, and for a moment no one moved. Then she raised one hand, as if pointing toward the basement door, and her mouth opened as if she were trying to speak. No sound came out, but I understood. She wanted us to go down there. James grabbed his phone and started recording, but when we looked at the footage later, there was nothing on it, just an empty staircase. But we had both seen her. We had both felt the cold, and we both knew that whatever was happening in that cabin was real. The next morning, we contacted a local elder from the Carcross Tagish First Nation. My grandmother had written his name in her journal, saying that he had helped her understand what was happening in the house. His name was Robert, and when we called him, he agreed to come out to the cabin that afternoon. When he arrived, he walked through the house slowly, touching the walls and pausing in certain rooms. He spent a long time standing at the top of the basement stairs, and then he turned to us and said something I will never forget. He told us that the cabin had been built on the site of an old murder. In 1898, during the height of the gold rush, a woman had been killed by her husband in a cabin that had once stood on this exact spot. Her body had never been found, and it was believed that he had sealed her remains inside the walls before burning the original structure to the ground. When my grandmother's cabin was built a few years later, it had been constructed directly over the ruins of the old cabin. The woman's spirit had never left. Robert explained that my grandmother had been keeping the spirit calm through offerings and prayers, rituals that she had learned from indigenous spiritual practitioners over the years. But now that she was gone, the spirit was becoming restless again. The woman was not trying to hurt us, Robert said. She was trapped, and she was desperate to be free. He offered to perform a cleansing ceremony to help guide her spirit to wherever it needed to go. We agreed immediately. The ceremony took place that evening. Robert burned sage and cedar, said prayers in his traditional language, and invited the spirit to release its hold on the physical world. James and I stood in the living room, watching as he moved through the house, stopping at each doorway and window to offer blessings. When he reached the basement door, he asked us to open it. James unlocked the door and pulled it open, and a rush of cold air came up from below. Robert descended the stairs, and we followed him with flashlights. The basement was small and damp, with stone walls and a dirt floor. In the corner, partially hidden by old boxes and debris, we found a section of the wall that had been disturbed. The stones were loose, and when Robert pulled them away, we saw bones. Human bones, small and fragile, wrapped in rotting fabric. Robert stopped the ceremony and told us we needed to contact the authorities. The next day, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police came to the cabin and excavated the remains. Forensic analysis later confirmed that they were the bones of a woman who had died in the late 1890s. The case was documented as a historical find, and the remains were eventually turned over to the local First Nations community for proper burial. After the bones were removed, Robert returned to complete the cleansing ceremony. This time, when he called out to the spirit, there was no response. The house felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight that had been hanging over us since we arrived was gone. We left Carcross 2 days later. I arranged for a property management company to handle the sale of the cabin, and I have not been back since. But I still think about that woman, trapped for more than a century, waiting for someone to find her. I think about my grandmother, who spent decades keeping her calm, performing rituals to honor her presence and give her peace. And I think about the fact that some places hold more than just memories. Some places hold pain and grief and the echoes of lives that ended too soon. I do not know if I believe in ghosts in the traditional sense, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt, and I know that the woman in that cabin was real. She was not a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. She was a person who had suffered, who had been forgotten, and who had finally been given the chance to rest. I am grateful that we were able to help her, but I will never forget the look in her hollow eyes, or the way she reached out to us, pleading silently for release. Some stories do not end when someone dies. Some stories linger, waiting for the right person to come along and finish them. And sometimes, whether we want to or not, we become part of those stories. I'm 24 years old, and I made a mistake last summer that I will regret for the rest of my life. I took a job that I should never have accepted, working for a man I should never have trusted, and I witnessed things that still wake me up in the middle of the night covered in cold sweat. This happened in the Yukon Territory, in an area that locals refuse to talk about. And if I had listened to the warnings I received before I left, maybe things would have turned out differently. Maybe Blake would still be alive. I grew up in British Columbia, in a small town near Prince George, and I had always been interested in mining and geology. When I graduated from college with a degree in earth sciences, I was struggling to find work in my field. The mining industry was not hiring much, and most of the jobs available were either unpaid internships or positions that required years of experience I did not have. So when I saw an advertisement online for a summer assistant position with a private prospector working claims in the Yukon, I applied immediately. The pay was good, better than anything else I had been offered, and the job description made it sound like an adventure. I would be living in a remote camp, helping with exploration and sample collection, and learning firsthand about mineral prospecting in one of the last true wilderness areas in North America. The man who hired me was named Blake Warner. He was in his early 50s, weathered and tough in the way that people who spend most of their lives outdoors tend to be. He had been prospecting in the Yukon for more than 20 years, working various claims across the territory, and he told me that this summer he would be focusing on an area near the border of Nahanni National Park. He said the land had good potential for gold and other minerals, and that he had been waiting years for the right conditions to start serious exploration work. When I asked him why he needed an assistant, he explained that he was getting older and that the physical labor of prospecting was becoming harder for him. He needed someone young and strong to help with the digging, hauling, and sample processing. It all seemed reasonable. I met Blake in Whitehorse in early June, and we drove north together in his truck, towing a trailer full of equipment and supplies. The drive took 2 days, and during that time Blake told me stories about his years in the bush. He was a good storyteller, and he had a dry sense of humor that I appreciated. But there was something about him that made me uneasy, something I could not quite put my finger on. He had a way of dismissing things that other people took seriously, and he seemed to have a deep contempt for anyone he considered superstitious or overly cautious. When I mentioned that I had read about the Nahanni region and its reputation for strange disappearances, he laughed and told me that those stories were just folklore designed to scare tourists. He said that people who got lost or died in the bush usually did so because they were unprepared or stupid, not because of curses or monsters. We arrived at the claim site in mid-June. It was located in a remote valley, accessible only by a rough dirt road that required 4-wheel drive and careful navigation. The camp itself consisted of 2 canvas tents, a cook area with a propane stove, and a storage tent for equipment and supplies. There was no cell phone service, no internet, and the nearest town was more than 100 kilometers away. We had a satellite phone for emergencies, but Blake made it clear that we would only use it if absolutely necessary. He wanted to minimize distractions and focus entirely on the work. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd expected. We spent our days hiking through the surrounding area, looking for promising outcrops and taking samples of rock and soil. Blake taught me how to use a metal detector, how to pan for gold in the nearby creek, and how to identify different types of mineral deposits. The work was hard, but I enjoyed it. The landscape was stunning, all rugged mountains and thick forests and rivers that ran clear and cold. At night, we would sit by the fire, and Blake would tell more stories, some about his own experiences, and others about the history of the Yukon gold rush. I felt like I was learning something valuable, and I was proud to be part of the adventure. But then we found the mine. It was in early July, about 3 weeks into the job. We were exploring a ridge on the eastern edge of the claim when Blake noticed something unusual. There was a depression in the ground, partially hidden by brush and fallen trees, that looked like it might be the entrance to an old mine shaft. We cleared away the debris and discovered that it was indeed a mine, or at least the remains of one. The entrance had partially collapsed, but there was still a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. Blake was immediately excited. He said that old mines were often good indicators of valuable mineral deposits, and that whoever had dug this shaft must have found something worth pursuing. I was less enthusiastic. The mine looked dangerous, and I could see that the timbers supporting the entrance were rotted and unstable. I suggested that we report the find to the authorities and let professional archaeologists or mining engineers assess it before we did anything else. Blake dismissed my concerns. He said that this was his claim and that he had every right to explore what was on it. He also pointed out that if we reported the mine, we would likely lose access to it, while bureaucrats decided what to do. He wanted to take a look inside first, to see if there was anything worth recovering. Against my better judgment, I agreed to help him. We spent the rest of that day clearing the entrance and shoring up the timbers with fresh lumber we had brought for building shelters. The next morning, we went inside. Blake went first, carrying a flashlight and a small pickaxe, and I followed with another flashlight and a backpack. The shaft descended at a steep angle, and the air inside was cold and damp. The walls were rough-hewn rock, and the floor was littered with debris and loose stones. We had to move carefully to avoid tripping or dislodging anything that might cause a collapse. About 30 meters into the shaft, we found the remains. They were lying in a small alcove that had been carved into the wall, and at first, I thought they were animal bones. But when Blake shined his light directly on them, I realized they were human. There were at least 2 skeletons, possibly more, all jumbled together in a way that suggested they had been placed there deliberately. The bones were old, probably more than a century, and they were arranged in a pattern that I did not understand. There were also artifacts scattered around the remains: gold nuggets, old tools, glass bottles, and what looked like ceremonial objects made of bone and stone. Blake was thrilled. He immediately started picking up the gold nuggets and examining them in the light. He estimated that there were several ounces worth, which at current prices would be worth thousands of dollars. I was horrified. I told him that we needed to leave everything exactly as we found it, that these were clearly human remains, and that disturbing them could be a crime. I also pointed out that the arrangement of the bones and the presence of ceremonial objects suggested that this might be a burial site, possibly connected to the indigenous people who had lived in the area for thousands of years. Blake ignored me. He filled his pockets with the gold nuggets and told me to take photos of everything so we would have a record. When I refused, he became angry. He said that I was being naive, that this gold did not belong to anyone anymore, and that we had a right to take what we found on his claim. He said that if I had a problem with it, I could leave. I should have left right then. I should have walked back to camp, packed my things, and demanded that he drive me back to Whitehorse. But I did not. I was young, and I needed the job, and I convinced myself that maybe Blake was right. Maybe the gold had been abandoned, and maybe taking it was not as wrong as it felt. So I stayed, and I helped him carry the gold back to camp. That night, Blake was in the best mood I had ever seen him in. He kept pulling the nuggets out of his pockets and examining them by the firelight, talking about how much they were worth and what he would do with the money. I sat across from him, feeling sick to my stomach, and watched the flames dance. That was when things started to go wrong. The first sign was the sound. Around midnight, when we were both lying in our tents trying to sleep, I heard it. It was a low, rhythmic drumming coming from somewhere in the forest. At first, I thought it might be an animal, or maybe the wind causing branches to hit against a tree, but the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate. It sounded like someone was beating a drum, slowly and steadily, over and over again. I called out to Blake, asking if he heard it, and he told me to shut up and go to sleep, but I could tell from his voice that he heard it too. The drumming continued for most of the night. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, and I would start to relax, thinking it was over. Then it would start again, closer than before. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted and on edge. Blake looked worse than I felt. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his hands were shaking as he made coffee. He did not mention the drumming, and neither did I. Over the next few days, more things started happening. We found footprints around the camp, bare human footprints that were too large to belong to either of us. Equipment went missing, and then reappeared in strange places. The fire would go out in the middle of the night, even though we had banked it properly. And the drumming continued, every night, getting louder and closer. Blake became increasingly paranoid and aggressive. He started carrying his rifle everywhere, even when we were just working around the camp. He accused me of sabotaging the equipment and playing tricks on him. His personality seemed to change overnight. The easygoing storyteller I had met in Whitehorse was gone, replaced by someone angry and unpredictable. On the 8th night, after we found the mine, I woke to the sound of Blake shouting. I unzipped my tent and saw him standing in the middle of the camp, holding his rifle and pointing it at the darkness. He was yelling at something, demanding that it show itself, threatening to shoot. I tried to calm him down, but he turned the rifle on me and told me to get back. I retreated to my tent, terrified, and stayed there until morning. When I came out, Blake was gone. His rifle was lying on the ground and his boots were sitting neatly by the fire. There were tracks leading away from the camp, toward the ridge where we had found the mine. I followed them. The tracks led me to the edge of a cliff that overlooked the valley below. Blake's body was at the bottom, broken and still. His head was separated from his body, lying several meters away. The gold nuggets he had taken from the mine were scattered around him, glinting in the morning sun. I stood there for a long time, staring down at what was left of him, trying to understand what had happened. The official explanation, when the RCMP finally came and investigated, was that Blake had fallen. They said he must have been sleepwalking or disoriented, and that he had walked off the cliff in the dark. They said the head injury was caused by the fall, that the rocks at the bottom had done that to him, but I knew better. I had seen the tracks. I'd seen the way his body was positioned, and I had seen the clean cut where his head had been severed from his neck. The investigation took weeks. I was questioned multiple times, and for a while, I think they suspected me of killing him. But there was no evidence, no weapon, and no motive. Eventually, they ruled it an accidental death, and I was allowed to leave. Before I left the Yukon, I went back to the mine with a member of the local indigenous community. His name was Joseph, and he was a spiritual leader for his people. I told him everything that had happened, and I showed him the photos I had taken inside the mine. He looked at them for a long time, and then he told me that we had disturbed a sacred burial site. He said that the people buried there had been placed with their possessions to help them in the next world, and that taking those objects was a violation that would bring consequences. He said that Blake had paid the price for his disrespect, and that I was lucky to be alive. Joseph performed a ceremony at the mine entrance, and I helped him return the gold nuggets and other artifacts that Blake had taken. We sealed the entrance as best we could, and Joseph said prayers asking for forgiveness and peace. After that, I left the Yukon and never went back. I found a job in Alberta, working for a mining company that operates in areas that have been properly surveyed and cleared. I never work alone, and I never take anything from a site without proper authorization, but I still have nightmares about that summer. I dream about the drumming, about Blake's body at the bottom of the cliff, about the look in his eyes during those final days when something was taking hold of him. And I think about the photos I took inside the mine, the ones I showed to Joseph. I deleted them after the ceremony, but before I did, I looked at them one more time. In the background of several photos, barely visible in the shadows, were figures. They were small and twisted, with elongated limbs and faces that did not look quite human. They were watching us even then, and I think they knew exactly what Blake was going to do. I do not tell people this story very often. When I do, they usually do not believe me. They say Blake must have been mentally unstable, or that I was traumatized and imagining things. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that some places are protected for a reason. The land remembers, and when you disrespect it, when you take what does not belong to you, the land takes something back. Blake learned that the hard way, and I carry that lesson with me every single day. I am 27 years old, and I am supposed to be a scientist. I am supposed to rely on evidence, data, and rational explanations for the things I observe in the world. But what happened to me last summer in the Yukon Territory defies every principle of logic and reason I have ever held. 3 people went missing on my research expedition, and despite extensive searches, investigations, and official inquiries, no one has been able to explain what happened to them. The official reports say exposure, animal attacks, accidents, but I was there. I saw what I saw, and I know that something else was responsible. I am a graduate student at the University of British Columbia, working on my master's degree in environmental science with a focus on climate change impacts on permafrost systems. My research involves studying how warming temperatures are affecting ground ice in Arctic and subarctic regions, and what that means for ecosystems, infrastructure, and carbon release. Last June, I was invited to join a field research team that would be spending 4 weeks in the northern Yukon, near the community of Old Crow, collecting data on permafrost thaw patterns and documenting changes in the landscape. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I had been hoping for, and I accepted immediately. The team consisted of 4 people. There was me, another graduate student named Piper Rogers, who was studying soil microbiology, a doctoral candidate named Jaden Morgan, who specialized in remote sensing and GIS mapping, and our guide, a man named Colton Reeves, who had been working in the Yukon wilderness for more than a decade. Colton was in his mid-30s, experienced and professional, and he had been recommended to us by the university because of his knowledge of the region and his excellent safety record. We flew into Old Crow in early July, and from there we took a chartered float plane to a remote lake where we would establish our base camp. The area we were studying was incredibly isolated. The nearest community was Old Crow, about 80 kilometers to the southwest, and there were no roads, no trails, and no other people for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. We were truly on our own out there, relying on satellite communication devices for emergency contact, and our own skills and preparation for everything else. The landscape was a mix of low tundra, scattered stands of stunted spruce trees, and countless small lakes and wetlands. It was beautiful in a stark, empty way, and during that time of year, the sun barely set. We had nearly 24 hours of daylight, which meant we could work long hours and make the most of our time in the field. The first week went smoothly. We established our camp on a rise overlooking the lake, set up our tents and equipment, and began our data collection routines. Each day, we would hike out to different sites, dig soil cores, take temperature measurements, document vegetation changes, and collect samples for analysis. Piper was studying microbial communities in the thawing permafrost, looking for changes in bacterial populations that might affect carbon cycling. Jaden was using drones to create detailed maps of the landscape, tracking changes in topography and vegetation over time. I was focused on measuring active layer depth and documenting evidence of ground subsidence and thermokarst formation. Colton kept us safe, monitored weather conditions, maintained our equipment, and made sure we stayed on schedule. But on the 8th day, Piper disappeared. It happened during what should have been a routine moment. We had finished dinner around 8 p.m., and Piper said she needed to use the bathroom. Our camp toilet was a simple setup, about 30 meters from the main tent area, just far enough for privacy but close enough to be safe. She grabbed a roll of toilet paper and walked off. We expected her back in 5 minutes. When 15 minutes passed and she had not returned, I called out to her. There was no response. Jaden and I walked over to the toilet area, and that is when we noticed something was wrong. The toilet paper roll was sitting on the ground, unused. There were no signs of her having been there. We called her name, louder this time, and started searching the immediate area. Colton joined us, and we expanded our search, checking around the camp perimeter, looking for any sign of where she might have gone. We found her footprints in a patch of soft ground leading away from the camp, heading toward a small grove of spruce trees about 50 meters to the north. The prints were clear and deliberate, walking in a straight line. But then, about 20 meters into the trees, the prints just stopped. There was no indication that she had turned around, no sign that she had jumped or run. The footprints simply ended, as if she had been lifted straight up into the air. We searched that area for hours, calling her name, looking for any clue about what had happened. We found nothing. No torn clothing, no blood, no disturbed ground, no animal tracks. She was just gone. Colton activated the emergency satellite communicator and contacted the authorities. A search and rescue team was dispatched from Whitehorse, and they arrived by helicopter the next afternoon. They brought dogs, additional personnel, and specialized equipment. They searched an area of more than 100 square kilometers over the next 4 days. They found nothing. No trace of Piper, no evidence of what had happened to her. The official theory was that she had become disoriented and wandered off, and that she had succumbed to exposure or fallen into one of the many small lakes or wetlands in the area. But I knew that did not make sense. Piper was experienced. She'd been on multiple field expeditions before, and the footprints ending in the middle of the forest, with no explanation, haunted all of us. The search and rescue team advised us to abandon the research project and return to Old Crow, but Jaden insisted on staying. He said that leaving would mean giving up on Piper, that we owed it to her to keep looking. Colton was reluctant, but he agreed to stay for a few more days. I did not want to stay. Every instinct I had was telling me that we needed to leave, that something about this place was wrong. But I could not bring myself to abandon the search either. So we stayed. That is when Jaden started acting strangely. He became fixated on the idea that Piper was still alive, that she was somewhere nearby and needed our help. He would spend hours walking through the forest, calling her name, sometimes in the middle of the night when the rest of us were trying to sleep. He claimed he could hear her voice, that she was calling back to him, begging for help. Colton and I never heard anything. We tried to convince Jaden that he was experiencing stress and exhaustion, that his mind was playing tricks on him, but he would not listen. He became increasingly agitated and erratic, refusing to eat properly, barely sleeping, and spending all his time searching. On the 14th night after Piper disappeared, Jaden woke us up around 2 a.m. He was standing outside the tents, shining his flashlight toward the trees and shouting that he had found her. He said he could see her standing on a ridge about 200 meters away, waving at him. Colton and I grabbed our own flashlights and looked in the direction Jaden was pointing. I could not see anything, just darkness and the silhouettes of trees against the pale night sky. But Jaden was insistent. He started running toward the ridge, ignoring our calls for him to stop. Colton and I followed him, trying to catch up, but Jaden was faster and more desperate. By the time we reached the ridge, he was gone. We searched for him through the rest of the night and into the next day. We found his flashlight lying on the ground near the top of the ridge, still turned on. A few meters away, we found Piper's jacket. It was folded neatly and placed on a flat rock, as if someone had deliberately left it there for us to find. There was no sign of Jaden, no footprints, no trail to follow. He had vanished, just like Piper. Colton made the decision to evacuate immediately. We packed up the camp as quickly as we could, loaded everything we could carry into our backpacks, and hiked to a clearing where a helicopter could land. Colton used the satellite communicator to request an emergency extraction, and we waited. I do not think either of us slept during that wait. We sat back to back in the middle of the clearing, watching the forest around us, listening to every sound. I kept expecting to see someone walking out of the trees, but no one came. The helicopter arrived 6 hours later, and we were airlifted out. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched a massive search operation. They brought in additional helicopters, ground teams, and even used infrared cameras to scan the area from the air. They found Jaden's body 3 weeks later, more than 80 kilometers from our camp. He was lying in a dry creek bed, and the cause of death was listed as hypothermia. But there was no explanation for how he had traveled that distance or why. There were no tracks leading to the location where he was found, no indication of how he had gotten there. It was as if he had simply appeared in that spot. Piper was never found. The search continued for 6 weeks before it was finally called off. The official conclusion was that she had died due to exposure or accident, and that her body was likely in one of the many lakes or wetlands in the area where it might never be recovered. But I know that is not what happened. I know that something took her, and I know that same something took Jaden. I finished my degree, but I changed my focus. I no longer work in remote field locations. I took a position with a research institute where I analyze data that other people collect, and I work in an office in the city. I've tried to move on, to put what happened behind me, but I cannot stop thinking about those footprints that ended in the middle of the forest. I cannot stop thinking about Jaden hearing Piper's voice calling to him from the darkness, and I cannot stop thinking about her jacket, folded so neatly on that rock, as if someone or something wanted us to know that she was gone. Colton does not work as a wilderness guide anymore. He moved to Whitehorse and took a job in construction. We have spoken a few times since that summer, and he has told me that he cannot go back into the wilderness. He says he feels like he is being watched whenever he is out there, like something is waiting for him. He says he knows that we were lucky to get out, and that if we had stayed even one more night, we might not have made it. I do not know what is out there in the northern Yukon near Old Crow. I do not know if it is something natural or something beyond our understanding, but I know that people disappear in that area, and they disappear in ways that make no sense. The authorities call it exposure, or accidents, or getting lost, but I was there. I saw the evidence, and I know that those explanations do not fit. Something else is happening out there, something that does not want us in that place. And I think we were only allowed to leave because we left quickly enough. If we had stayed, if we had kept searching, I think we would have disappeared too, and no one would have ever found us. I'm 35 years old, and I have spent most of my adult life working in the wilderness. I have been a hunting guide, a trapper, a wilderness survival instructor, and a field researcher. I have spent months at a time living alone in remote locations, and I have always been confident in my abilities and comfortable with solitude. But what happened to me during the winter I spent alone in a cabin in the central Yukon changed everything. It broke something inside me that I'm not sure will ever heal. I no longer trust my own mind, my own senses, or my own memories. And I no longer go into the wilderness alone. The cabin was located about 150 kilometers northeast of Carmacks, accessible only by snowmobile or small plane, depending on the season. It was a traditional trapper's cabin, built decades ago and maintained by a rotating series of people who used it during the winter months to run trap lines through the surrounding territory. I'd used the cabin several times before, and I knew it well. It was solid, well insulated, and equipped with everything I needed for a winter alone. There was a wood stove, bunks, basic cooking equipment, and enough storage space for supplies. I had arranged to spend December through March there, running my trap lines and living off the land as much as possible. It was something I had done 8 times before, and I looked forward to it every year. The isolation, the silence, the challenge of surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It was where I felt most alive. I flew into the cabin in early December, just as the winter darkness was settling in. By that time of year, daylight in that part of the Yukon is limited to maybe 4 or 5 hours, and the sun stays low on the horizon even when it is up. The rest of the time, you are living in twilight or complete darkness. The temperatures drop to -30 or -40 Celsius on a regular basis, and sometimes even colder. But I was prepared. I'd brought enough food to last 4 months, supplemented by whatever I could trap or hunt. I had fuel for the stove, batteries for my headlamp, a satellite phone for emergencies, and all the equipment I needed to maintain my trap lines. I felt confident and ready. The first 2 weeks went exactly as expected. I spent my days checking traps, skinning animals, preparing pelts, and maintaining the cabin. I cut firewood, melted snow for water, and cooked simple meals on the wood stove. In the evenings, I would read by lamplight or listen to the radio, picking up faint signals from stations hundreds of kilometers away. The nights were long and dark, but I did not mind. I had done this before, and I knew how to manage the isolation. I kept myself busy, maintained a routine, and stayed focused on the work. But in the 3rd week, I started noticing something strange. I would wake up in the morning and find boot prints in the snow outside the cabin. They were large, larger than mine, and they circled the cabin in a pattern that made no sense. The prints would start at the edge of the clearing, circle the cabin 2 or 3 times, and then lead back into the forest in the same direction they had come from. At first, I thought another trapper might be in the area, someone I did not know about. But that seemed unlikely. The nearest trapline territory was more than 50 kilometers away, and there was no reason for someone to come this far just to walk around my cabin in the middle of the night. I checked my equipment and supplies to see if anything had been disturbed or taken, but everything was exactly as I had left it. The prints appeared 3 more times over the next week, always in the same pattern, always during the night. I started staying awake, listening, trying to catch whoever or whatever was out there, but I never heard anything. No footsteps, no voices, no sound of a snowmobile, just silence. And then, in the morning, the prints would be there again. Then the radio started acting strangely. I would turn it on to listen to music or news, and instead of picking up a broadcast, I would hear a voice. It was faint at first, barely audible beneath the static. But as the days went on, it got louder, and I realized with growing horror that the voice sounded like mine. It was reading entries from my journal, word for word, passages I had written days or weeks earlier. I would sit there, listening to my own voice coming through the radio, describing my daily activities, my thoughts, my observations. It felt like someone was inside my head, pulling out my private thoughts and broadcasting them back to me. I stopped using the radio. I convinced myself it was some kind of interference, a weird phenomenon caused by atmospheric conditions or solar activity. I had heard of strange radio anomalies happening in the far north, but deep down, I knew that did not explain it. How could the radio be picking up my journal entries? How could it be reproducing my voice? In January, when the darkness was at its deepest and the temperatures were at their lowest, the knocking started. It would happen around 3 a.m. almost every night. 2 slow, deliberate knocks on the cabin wall, always in the same spot near the door. Then silence for exactly 30 seconds. Then 2 more knocks, this time on a different wall. Then silence. Then 2 more knocks. The pattern would continue for 15 or 20 minutes, moving around the cabin, and then it would stop. I would lie in my bunk, listening, trying to stay calm, telling myself it was just the wood contracting in the cold, or a branch hitting the cabin, or ice shifting. But the knocking was too regular, too deliberate. It did not sound like a natural phenomenon, and it sounded like someone was out there, testing the walls, looking for a way in. One night, I grabbed my flashlight and went outside to confront whoever was doing this. I threw open the door and shined my light into the darkness, shouting for whoever was out there to show themselves. The knocking stopped immediately. I walked around the cabin, checking every wall, looking for tracks or any sign of a person or animal. I found nothing. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed except for my own footprints. But when I went back inside and closed the door, the knocking started again almost immediately, this time louder and more insistent. I started finding offerings outside the cabin door, small animals mostly, a frozen hare ranged carefully on the doorstep, a ptarmigan, its neck broken, placed on the woodpile, a fox, its body still fresh, positioned directly in front of the door, as if it had been left there deliberately. Each time the animals were arranged in a specific way, laid out flat, with their limbs extended, their heads pointing toward the cabin. And around each animal, scratched into the snow, were symbols, lines and circles and shapes that I did not recognize, that did not look like anything I had ever seen before. I started to lose track of time. The darkness, the isolation, the lack of sleep, it all started to blur together. I would sit at the table trying to read or write in my journal, and I would lose hours without realizing it. I would look up and discover that half a day had passed, with no memory of what I had been doing. My journal entries became confused and contradictory. I would write something, and then later I would find additional entries that I did not remember writing, passages that described things I did not remember doing or thinking. One morning, I woke up to find my reflection in the small mirror above the sink, behaving strangely. I was brushing my teeth, and I noticed that my reflection was moving slightly differently than I was. The movements were delayed by maybe a second or two, like watching a video with the audio out of sync. I stopped moving, and my reflection stopped a moment later. I waved my hand, and my reflection waved back, but not at exactly the same time. I stood there for 10 minutes, testing this, trying to understand what was happening. And then my reflection smiled at me, even though I was not smiling. It was a small, subtle smile, but it was unmistakable. I stepped back from the mirror, my heart pounding, and covered it with a towel. I did not look in that mirror again for the rest of the winter. The worst night came in early February. I went to bed around 10 p.m., exhausted from a long day of checking traps. I remember lying down, pulling the blankets over myself, and closing my eyes. The next thing I remember, I was waking up to freezing cold air blowing across my face. I opened my eyes and realized the cabin door was wide open. Snow was blowing inside, and the temperature had dropped so much that I could see my breath in thick clouds. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door to close it, and that is when I saw the footprints. They led from my bunk, across the cabin floor, out the door, and into the snow. They were my footprints, my boot prints. I looked down at my feet and realized I was wearing my boots. I'd walked out of the cabin in my sleep and then apparently turned around and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind me. I followed the prints outside, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The tracks led in a large circle around the cabin, the same pattern I had been seeing for weeks. I had been the one making the prints. I had been walking around the cabin at night, in my sleep, and I had no memory of it. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. How many times had I done this? How many times had I wandered outside in the freezing darkness, completely unconscious? But then I noticed something else. The tracks did not just circle the cabin. They led into the forest, deep into the trees, following one of my trapline trails. I followed them for about 100 meters, and then they stopped at a small clearing. In the center of the clearing, scratched into the snow, were more symbols, the same symbols I had been finding around the dead animals. And next to the symbols was my journal, lying open in the snow. I picked it up and looked at the pages. There were entries I did not remember writing, long, rambling passages about things I did not understand, descriptions of voices in the darkness, instructions for rituals I had never heard of, warnings about something that was coming. I took the journal back to the cabin and read through it by lamplight. The entries became increasingly disturbing as I went through them. Whoever or whatever had been writing in my journal was claiming to be me, but describing experiences and thoughts that I had no memory of. It described walking through the forest at night, following something that was calling to me. It described performing rituals at specific locations, leaving offerings, trying to make contact with something that lived in the darkness. And it described a presence, something that had been watching me since I arrived, something that wanted to get inside. That was when I called for extraction. I used the satellite phone to contact the charter company that had flown me in, and I told them I needed to leave immediately. They asked if it was a medical emergency, and I said yes. I could not explain what was really happening. I could not tell them that I was losing my mind, that I was doing things I did not remember, that something was using me. They said they would send a plane as soon as weather permitted, which would be in 2 or 3 days. Those 2 days were the longest of my life. I did not sleep. I sat at the table with a knife in my hand, watching the door, listening to the knocking that continued every night. I barricaded the door with furniture, tying it shut with rope, making sure I could not open it even if I tried to walk out in my sleep again. And I waited. The plane came on the 3rd day. The pilot landed on the frozen lake about 1 kilometer from the cabin, and I loaded my essential gear and left everything else behind. I did not care about my traps, my pelts, my supplies. I just wanted to get out. As we flew away, I looked down at the cabin, and I saw footprints in the snow. Fresh footprints, leading from the cabin into the forest, even though I had been inside with the door barricaded the entire time. I spent 2 weeks in Whitehorse, being evaluated by doctors. They said I was suffering from cabin fever, isolation-induced psychosis, sleep deprivation. They gave me medication and told me to rest. But I knew it was more than that. I knew something had been out there with me, something that had been trying to get inside my head, trying to take control, and I think it almost succeeded. I do not trap anymore. I moved to Whitehorse and took a job in construction, working around other people, living in a house in town. I still have the journal, and I still read through it sometimes, trying to understand what happened. But the entries I do not remember writing make no sense. They are written in my handwriting, but they are not my words. They are something else, something that was using me to communicate. I do not know what lives out there in the Yukon wilderness, in the darkness of winter, in the places where no one goes. But I know it is real, and I know it is still out there, waiting for the next person who thinks they are strong enough to face the isolation alone. I thought I was that person. I was wrong. I'm 23 years old, and I have driven the Dempster Highway 3 times in my life. The first 2 times were during the summer, when the road is busy with tourists and adventure travelers making their way north to Inuvik. Those trips were beautiful and uneventful. But the 3rd time, in October of last year, I experienced something that I still cannot explain. Something that has made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I saw a creature on that highway, something that should not exist, and I have the physical evidence to prove that I did not imagine it. The Dempster Highway is one of the most remote roads in North America. It runs for 740 kilometers from Dawson City in the Yukon Territory north to Inuvik in the Northwest Territories, cutting through some of the most isolated and rugged wilderness on the continent. For most of its length, there are no services, no gas stations, no towns, just gravel road, mountains, tundra, and the occasional emergency shelter. In the summer, you might see other vehicles every hour or so. But in October, as winter approaches and most tourists have left, you can drive for hours without seeing another soul. I was driving north to Inuvik to visit a friend who worked there as a nurse. I had planned the trip for months, coordinating my time off from work and making sure my vehicle was in good condition for the journey. I was driving a Toyota 4Runner, older but reliable, with good tires and a full tank of gas. I had spare fuel in jerry cans, emergency supplies, a satellite communicator, and cold weather gear. I was as prepared as anyone could be for that drive. I left Dawson City around noon on October 15th, planning to make it to the Eagle Plains Hotel, the only roadhouse on the entire highway, by evening. From there, I would continue north the next morning. The weather was cold but clear when I left, and the drive went smoothly for the first few hours. I crossed the Ogilvy River, climbed through the Ogilvy Mountains, and descended onto the plateau that stretches north toward the Arctic Circle. The landscape was stark and beautiful, all browns and grays and the deep green of stunted spruce trees. As the afternoon wore on, the sun dropped lower in the sky, and by 6 p.m. it was starting to get dark. I still had about 100 kilometers to go before reaching Eagle Plains, so I turned on my headlights and continued driving. That is when I saw it for the first time. I was rounding a curve, driving carefully on the loose gravel, when something ran across the road about 50 meters ahead of me. At first, I thought it was a caribou or a moose. Wildlife crossings are common on the Dempster, and you have to be constantly alert for animals on the road. But this was not a caribou or a moose. It was moving on 2 legs, upright like a human, but it was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with impossibly long limbs and a body that looked emaciated, like all the flesh had been stripped away, leaving only skin stretched over bone. It crossed the road in 3 or 4 strides, moving with a speed and fluidity that did not look natural, and disappeared into the brush on the other side. I slammed on the brakes and sat there for a moment, trying to process what I had just seen. My first thought was that it had to be a person. Maybe someone in distress, maybe someone who had broken down and was trying to flag down help. But the size was all wrong, and the way it moved was wrong. No human could cover that much ground that quickly, and no human had limbs that long. I considered getting out of the vehicle to investigate, but something stopped me. Some instinct deep in my gut told me that whatever I had just seen was not something I wanted to get closer to. I started driving again slowly, scanning the tree line on both sides of the road. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I told myself I had been mistaken, that it had been an animal, that the poor light and my tired eyes had played tricks on me. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it was not an animal. For the next 20 kilometers, nothing happened. I kept driving, checking my mirrors constantly, watching the road ahead. The sun had set completely now, and I was driving through full darkness, with only my headlights cutting through the night, and then I saw it again. This time, it was not crossing the road. It was running alongside it, paralleling my vehicle, keeping pace with me. I was driving at about 90 kilometers per hour, and this thing was matching my speed. I could see it out of the corner of my right eye, moving through the brush about 10 or 15 meters from the road. A tall, pale figure, loping along on 2 legs, its movements jerky and unnatural, like watching a video that has been sped up slightly. I pressed down harder on the accelerator, pushing the Forerunner up to 100, then 110 kilometers per hour. The creature kept pace. I could see it more clearly now in the headlights when the road curved and the light swept across the landscape. Its skin was pale, almost white, and it looked stretched too tight over its frame. Its head was elongated, and its limbs bent at angles that should not have been possible. And then it turned its head and looked directly at me. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing yellow-green, the way an animal's eyes do at night. But these eyes were larger, and there was something about the way they focused on me that felt intelligent and predatory. I kept driving, my foot pressed to the floor, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the thing running beside me. And then suddenly, it was gone. I could not see it anymore. I slowed down slightly, looking around, trying to figure out where it had gone. That is when my headlights illuminated the road directly ahead, and I saw it standing there, right in the middle of the highway, maybe 30 meters in front of me, facing my direction. It was standing completely still, its arms hanging at its sides, its head tilted slightly to one side as if it were studying me, waiting for me to get closer. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stop, to turn around, to do anything but continue driving toward that thing. but there was nowhere to turn around on this stretch of road. The shoulders dropped off into deep ditches on both sides, and the road was too narrow to make a U-turn. The only option was to go forward. So I did. I accelerated, aiming straight for it, hoping it would move out of the way. It did not move. It just stood there, watching, as I bore down on it. And then, at the last possible second, it smiled. I saw its mouth stretch open, wider than any mouth should be able to open, revealing too many teeth, all sharp and uneven. And then I hit it. The impact was hard, harder than I expected. The front of the 4Runner slammed into the creature, and I felt the vehicle jolt and shudder. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, there was nothing on the road behind me. No body, no sign of what I had just hit. I kept driving, not slowing down, not stopping, just putting as much distance as possible between me and that spot. I drove another 40 kilometers before I finally reached the emergency shelter at Moose Creek, a small cabin maintained by the Highway Department for stranded travelers. I pulled into the parking area and sat in the vehicle for several minutes, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that I had not just experienced what I thought I had experienced. Then I got out and walked around to the front of the 4Runner to inspect for damage. The front bumper was dented badly. There was a massive crease running across the center, and the metal was bent inward. And embedded in the dent, caught in the crack, was hair. Black hair, thick and coarse, nothing like the pale skin I had seen on the creature. I pulled out a few strands and held them up in the light from my headlamp. They did not look like any animal hair I had ever seen. They were too thick, too wiry, and they had a strange texture, almost like metal wire. I went inside the shelter and found 2 other travelers there, a couple from Germany, who were also making their way north. I asked them if they had seen anything unusual on the road, and they looked at me strangely. They said they had not seen anything except a few caribou. I showed them the hair and the damage to my bumper, and they suggested I might have hit a bear or a moose without realizing it. But I knew that was not what had happened. I knew what I had hit, and I knew it had not been an animal. I stayed at the shelter for the night, sleeping in my vehicle with the doors locked and the engine running for heat. The next morning, I continued north to Inuvik, and I told my friend what had happened. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she told me that I was not the first person to report seeing something like that on the Dempster Highway. She said that several people over the years had described similar encounters. Tall, pale figures that moved too fast and appeared on the road at night. The local indigenous communities had stories about such creatures, she said. Beings that were not quite human and not quite animal. Things that hunted in the wilderness and preyed on travelers. Before I left Inuvik to drive back south, I took a sample of the hair to a biology lab at the local research station. They agreed to analyze it, and I left my contact information. 3 weeks later, they sent me an email. The results were inconclusive. The hair was mammalian, but it did not match any known species in their database. The DNA was degraded or contaminated, and they could not make a definitive identification. They suggested it might be from a hybrid animal or a species not yet documented, but they had no explanation for the unusual structure of the hair itself. I still have the hair samples. I keep them in a plastic bag in my desk drawer, and sometimes I take them out and look at them, trying to convince myself that there is a rational explanation for all of this. But I know there is not. I know what I saw, I know what I hit, and I know that whatever it was real. I have not driven the Dempster Highway since that night. I have no plans to go back. When people ask me about my trip to Inuvik, I usually give them a short, polite answer and change the subject. I do not tell them about the creature. I do not tell them about the way it smiled at me before I hit it, or the way its eyes reflected in my headlights. I do not tell them that I still have nightmares about it, that I still see that elongated face staring at me through my windshield, because I know they would not believe me, and maybe that is for the best. But I will tell you this. If you ever drive the Dempster Highway in the fall or winter, when the days are short and the nights are long, pay attention to the road. If you see something moving in the darkness, something tall and pale that does not belong, do not stop. Do not investigate. Just keep driving as fast as you can and do not look back, because some things in the Yukon wilderness are not meant to be seen, and some encounters are not meant to be survived. I was lucky. I got away, but I know that not everyone who meets that creature on the highway is as fortunate as I was. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a conservation officer for the Yukon Territorial Government. My job involves patrolling remote areas, enforcing wildlife regulations, checking hunting and fishing licenses, and investigating reports of illegal activity. It is work that I love, work that takes me into some of the most beautiful and isolated places in the territory. But last August, I encountered something on the Yukon River that has fundamentally changed how I view my job and the risks that come with it. I came face to face with a man who should not have been there, and if I had made one wrong decision, I would not be here to tell this story. It was mid-August, and I was on a routine patrol along a section of the Yukon River about 60 kilometers east of Carmacks. This is an area that sees very little traffic, even during the summer months. Most recreational boaters and paddlers stick to the more popular sections of the river closer to Whitehorse or Dawson City. This stretch is isolated, with no road access and no settlements for dozens of kilometers in any direction. It is also an area that has a history of illegal hunting and trapping, which is why we patrol it regularly during the summer and fall. I was traveling alone in a 16-foot aluminum boat with an outboard motor, standard equipment for river patrols. I had my radio, a satellite phone, my service weapon, and all the gear I needed for several days in the field. The weather was perfect, clear skies and warm temperatures, and the river was running at a good level. I was planning to check a few known camping spots where poachers sometimes set up, and then I would head back to Carmacks the next day. Around 2 p.m. I came around a bend in the river and spotted smoke rising from the trees ahead. It looked like a campfire, which was not unusual, but something about it caught my attention. The smoke was coming from an area near an old mining camp, a site that had been abandoned since the 1930s. The buildings had long since collapsed, but there were still remnants of the old settlement scattered through the forest. It was not a place where people typically camped. The area was overgrown, difficult to access from the water, and there were better camping spots just a few kilometers upstream. But someone was there, and as a conservation officer, it was my job to check it out. I pulled the boat up onto a gravel bar about 100 meters downstream from where I had seen the smoke and tied it off to a piece of driftwood. I grabbed my radio and my equipment belt, which included my sidearm, pepper spray, and handcuffs, and started walking upstream along the riverbank. As I got closer, I could see a tent set up in a small clearing, a blue dome tent that looked relatively new. There was a campfire burning, and I could see supplies scattered around the area, a backpack, some food containers, a tarp stretched between trees. But I did not see anyone. I called out, identifying myself as a conservation officer and asking if anyone was there. There was no response. I called out again, louder this time, and waited. Still nothing. I approached the camp slowly, keeping my eyes on the tent and the surrounding forest. As I got closer, I noticed something that immediately set off alarm bells in my head. On a log near the fire, there was a police scanner, turned on and quietly crackling with radio traffic. Next to it was a detailed topographic map of the area, and on the map, several locations had been marked with red circles. I bent down to look at the map more closely, and I realized with growing unease that the marked locations were homesteads and cabins, places where people lived or spent time during the summer months. I stood up and looked around the camp more carefully. There was a pair of binoculars hanging from a tree branch, high-powered ones that looked expensive. And near the tent entrance, partially hidden under a jacket, I saw a box of zip ties. the kind that police and security personnel use as disposable handcuffs, the kind that have no legitimate use in a wilderness camping situation. My training kicked in immediately. This was not a normal camping situation. This was something else, something potentially very dangerous. I reached for my radio to call for backup, but before I could key the microphone, I heard a voice behind me. "Can I help you with something, officer?" I spun around and found myself facing a man who had emerged from the forest without making a sound. He was in his late 30s or early 40s, average height and build, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. He had a beard and was smiling at me in a way that seemed friendly and non-threatening. But everything about the situation felt wrong. How had he gotten behind me without me hearing him? How long had he been watching me examine his camp? I identified myself again and asked him what he was doing in the area. He told me he was just camping, enjoying some time in the wilderness, exploring the old mining sites. His voice was calm and pleasant, and his story sounded reasonable on the surface, but I kept noticing small details that did not add up. He had scratches on his arms and face, fresh ones that looked like they had come from a struggle. There were dark stains on his shirt that could have been mud, but looked more like blood. And when I asked him about the police scanner and the map with the marked locations, his expression changed for just a fraction of a second. The friendly smile slipped, and I saw something else underneath. Something cold and calculating. He recovered quickly and laughed it off. He said the police scanner was for monitoring weather reports and emergency broadcasts, that it was a safety precaution when camping alone in remote areas. He said the map markings were just places he wanted to visit, old cabins he was interested in photographing. His explanations were smooth and practiced, but I did not believe any of them. Every instinct I had was screaming that this man was dangerous, that I needed to get away from him and call for backup immediately. I told him I would need to see some identification and asked if he had any hunting or fishing equipment with him. He said he did not have any identification on him, that it was in his vehicle back in Whitehorse, and that he was not hunting or fishing. As he spoke, he took a step closer to me, and I noticed his hands were moving slightly, almost like he was preparing to do something. I put my hand on my service weapon, not drawing it, just resting my hand on the grip in a way that made it clear I was ready to use it if necessary. That is when his demeanor changed completely. The friendly facade dropped away, and he looked at me with open hostility. He asked me if I thought I was going to arrest him, if I thought my little gun was going to stop him. He told me that I should leave, that I should get back in my boat and forget I ever saw him. His voice was low and threatening, and he took another step toward me. I drew my weapon and ordered him to stop to get on the ground. He did not comply. Instead, he laughed, a cold, humorless sound, and told me that I had no idea what I was dealing with. I started backing toward the river, keeping my weapon trained on him, and reached for my radio with my free hand. I keyed the microphone and called for assistance, giving my location and a brief description of the situation. The man lunged toward me, and I fired a warning shot into the air. He stopped, but his expression made it clear that he was calculating his next move, deciding whether he could reach me before I could fire again. I continued backing away, moving as quickly as I could without turning my back on him, shouting at him to stay where he was. When I reached the gravel bar where my boat was tied, I kept my weapon trained on the man as I untied the boat and pushed it into the water. He started walking toward me, moving slowly and deliberately, and I fired another shot, this time into the ground near his feet. He stopped again, but I could see in his eyes that he was not afraid. He was angry, and he was planning something. I climbed into the boat and started the engine, keeping the weapon pointed at him as I backed away from the shore. He stood at the water's edge watching me, and then he turned and walked calmly back into the forest. I did not take my eyes off the tree line until I had put at least 500 meters between us. Then I holstered my weapon, grabbed the radio, and gave a full report of what had happened. I provided detailed descriptions of the man, the camp, and the evidence I had seen. The dispatcher told me that RCMP officers were being dispatched to the area and that I should wait at a safe location downstream. I anchored the boat in the middle of the river, where I had a clear view of both banks, and waited. 2 hours later, an RCMP helicopter arrived, and they inserted a tactical team into the area where the man's camp had been. I stayed in the boat, watching from a distance, as the officers moved through the forest. They searched the camp and the surrounding area for hours, but they did not find the man. He had vanished. His tent and supplies were still there, but he was gone. The police scanner, the map, the zip ties, all of it was collected as evidence. Over the next few days, as the investigation continued, I learned who the man was. His name was in the system, and he was wanted in connection with 3 murders in Alaska. He had been on the run for more than a year, moving through remote areas of Alaska and the Yukon, staying off the grid, avoiding detection. The marked locations on his map corresponded to isolated cabins and homesteads in the area, places where he had likely been planning to break in, or worse. The police scanner had been used to monitor law enforcement frequencies to stay one step ahead of anyone looking for him. A massive manhunt was launched. RCMP officers, search and rescue teams, and wildlife officers combed the area for 12 days, searching for any sign of him. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the forest, and ground teams checked every abandoned building, every cave, every possible hiding spot. But he was not found. And then, on the 13th day, a hiker discovered a body in a ravine about 15 kilometers from where the camp had been. It was the fugitive. He had apparently fallen or jumped from a cliff, and the cause of death was determined to be massive blunt force trauma. The official conclusion was suicide, that he had decided to end his own life rather than face capture. But I have never been entirely convinced of that explanation. The location where his body was found was remote and difficult to access, and there was no clear reason why he would have gone there. Some of the officers involved in the search suggested that he might have been trying to escape through the wilderness and had simply made a fatal mistake. But I keep thinking about the way he looked at me that day, the coldness in his eyes, the confidence in his voice. He did not seem like someone who would give up. He seemed like someone who would fight until the very end. I returned to work after a few days of mandatory leave, but I have not been the same since that encounter. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the risks. I never patrol alone anymore if I can avoid it, and I'm constantly on alert for anything that seems out of place. Because I learned something that day on the Yukon River. I learned that the wilderness is not just home to animals and natural dangers. It is also home to people, some of whom are running from something, hiding from something, or planning something terrible. And as a conservation officer, I am sometimes the only thing standing between those people and the innocent victims they are targeting. I think about that day often. I think about what would have happened if I had not noticed the police scanner and the map, if I had not sensed that something was wrong. I think about what would have happened if he had rushed me before I could draw my weapon, or if I had been just a little slower in getting back to the boat. I was lucky. I made the right decisions, and I got away. But I know that if I had turned my back on him for even a second, if I had hesitated or second-guessed myself, I would be another missing person case, another body found months or years later in some remote corner of the Yukon wilderness. And that thought never leaves me. I'm 26 years old, and I never expected that my hobby would lead me to uncover a crime that had been hidden for more than 50 years. I am an amateur metal detectorist, which means I spend my free time searching for buried objects in historical sites, old homesteads, and areas where people lived or worked decades or centuries ago. Most of what I find is junk, old nails, bottle caps, pull tabs from aluminum cans, but occasionally I find something interesting. A coin from the early 1900s, a piece of old jewelry, an artifact that tells a story about the people who came before us. But last summer I found something that I wish I had never discovered. Something that brought a 51-year-old murder case to light and revealed a darkness that had been buried in the Yukon soil for half a century. I live in Whitehorse, and I have been metal detecting for about 4 years. I got into it after watching videos online and reading about the incredible historical finds that people were making in places like England and the American South. The Yukon seemed like the perfect place for this hobby. The territory has such a rich history, especially from the gold rush era of the late 1890s, and there are countless old mining camps, abandoned homesteads, and historical sites scattered across the landscape. Most of them are on public land, accessible to anyone willing to make the hike. I always make sure to follow the rules, obtain any necessary permits, and respect archaeological sites. I am not a looter or a grave robber. I am a hobbyist who loves history and enjoys the thrill of discovering objects that connect us to the past. Last July, my friend Mackenzie and I decided to spend a weekend exploring some old gold rush sites near Dawson City. Mackenzie is also a metal detectorist, and we had been planning this trip for months. We had researched several locations that we thought might yield interesting finds. Old claims that had been worked during the gold rush but had been abandoned for more than a century. We were not looking for gold, exactly. We knew that anything valuable had been picked over long ago, but we were hoping to find old tools, coins, or personal items that miners might have left behind. We drove to Dawson City on a Friday afternoon, set up camp at a nearby campground, and spent the next morning hiking to our first location. It was an old claim site about 10 kilometers outside of town, accessible by a rough trail that wound through thick spruce forest. The site itself was overgrown, with only a few remnants of the original workings visible. There were depressions in the ground where miners had dug, piles of tailings covered with moss, and the rotted remains of what might have once been a sluice box. It was exactly the kind of place we loved to search. We spent several hours working the area with our metal detectors, moving slowly and methodically, listening for the beeps and chirps that indicated metal buried beneath the surface. Mackenzie found a few old square nails and what looked like part of a pickaxe head. I found some rusty tin cans and a few pieces of wire. Nothing particularly exciting, but that is often how metal detecting goes. You search for hours and find mostly trash, and then suddenly you hit something that makes it all worthwhile. Around 2 p.m., I got a strong signal from my detector in an area near the base of a small hill. The signal was deep, which meant whatever was buried there was substantial and had been in the ground for a long time. I called Mackenzie over, and we started digging carefully with our shovels and hand trowels. We went down about 4 feet before we hit something solid. It was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, made of rusted iron with a simple latch. It was heavy, and when we pulled it out of the ground and brushed away the dirt, we could see that it was very old. The metal was corroded and pitted, and the latch was frozen with rust. But it was intact. Mackenzie and I looked at each other, both of us feeling a mixture of excitement and unease. Finding something like this was unusual. Miners did not typically bury strong boxes 4 feet underground in the middle of their claims. They kept valuables in their cabins or took them to town for safekeeping. So why was this box buried here, hidden so deeply that only a metal detector could find it? We tried to open the latch, but it would not budge. We considered forcing it open, but Mackenzie suggested that we should be careful. If the box contained something of historical significance, we did not want to damage it. We decided to take it back to our camp and open it there, where we had better tools and light. We filled in the hole we had dug, marked the GPS coordinates of the location, and hiked back to the campground. Back at camp, we used a hammer and chisel to carefully break the rusted latch. The lid creaked open, and what we found inside made my stomach turn. The box was filled with human teeth. Dozens of them, maybe 50 or more, all loose and jumbled together. Many of them still had gold fillings intact. Mixed in with the teeth were pieces of jewelry, rings, a necklace, a pocket watch, and at the bottom of the box, a leather wallet. I picked up the wallet with shaking hands and opened it. Inside was an identification card, old and brittle with age, with a name and photo. The name was Daniel Hartman, and the issue date on the ID was 1974. Mackenzie and I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the contents of the box. This was not a historical artifact from the gold rush era. This was something much more recent. And the teeth, the gold fillings, the personal items, they all pointed to something horrifying. Someone had removed the teeth from a human body, someone who had been killed in 1974 or later. And whoever had done this had buried the evidence here, hoping it would never be found. Mackenzie insisted that we call the police immediately. I agreed. We packed the box, carefully took photos of everything, and drove into Dawson City to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment. The officer on duty listened to our story, examined the box and its contents, and immediately called for a detective. Within an hour, we were giving formal statements, and the box was being sent to Whitehorse for forensic analysis. The investigation that followed was extensive and disturbing. Forensic experts confirmed that the teeth were human and that they had been removed post-mortem, likely with pliers or similar tools. The dental work, including the gold fillings, was consistent with dentistry from the 1970s. The ID in the wallet belonged to Daniel Hartman, a prospector who had been reported missing in August of 1974. He had been 43 years old at the time of his disappearance, working a claim near Dawson City, and he had simply vanished. His truck had been found abandoned near his claim, but there had been no sign of foul play, no body, and no leads. The case had gone cold decades ago, but now, with the discovery of the strongbox, the RCMP reopened the investigation. They used the GPS coordinates we had provided to return to the site where we had found the box and conducted a thorough search of the area. They brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and forensic archaeologists, and they found more. Buried nearby, in several shallow graves, were the remains of Daniel Hartman. The bones were incomplete, and it was clear that the body had been dismembered and scattered to make identification more difficult. But dental records confirmed it was him. The investigation also revealed something else. The land where we had found the box and the remains had once been part of a larger claim owned by a man named Walter Briggs. Briggs had been a prospector and claim owner in the area during the 1970s, and he had a reputation for being difficult and aggressive. He had been involved in several disputes with other miners over the years, including Daniel Hartman. According to old records and interviews with people who had known both men, Briggs and Hartman had been in a heated conflict over the boundaries of their claims. Hartman had accused Briggs of encroaching on his property, and the dispute had escalated to threats and confrontations. Walter Briggs was now 81 years old and living in a care facility in Whitehorse. When the RCMP confronted him with the evidence, he confessed. He admitted that he had killed Daniel Hartman in August of 1974 during an argument over the claim boundaries. He said that Hartman had come to his cabin armed with a rifle, threatening to shoot him if he did not stop mining on disputed land. Briggs claimed self-defense, saying he had grabbed his own rifle and shot Hartman first. But then, instead of reporting it to the police, he had panicked. He dismembered the body, removed the teeth to prevent identification through dental records, and buried the remains in several locations on his property. He kept the teeth and the personal items in the strongbox, intending to dispose of them later, but he never did. He simply buried the box and tried to forget about it. The confession led to further revelations. Briggs admitted to 2 other murders, both prospectors who had disappeared in the 1970s and 1980s under similar circumstances. He had killed them during disputes over mining rights and had buried their remains in remote locations that had never been searched. The RCMP launched additional investigations, and over the next several months, they recovered partial remains from 2 other victims. Briggs was charged with 3 counts of murder, and even though he was elderly and in poor health, he was prosecuted and convicted. He died in custody less than a year later. For Mackenzie and me, the experience was traumatic. We had gone out looking for historical artifacts and had instead uncovered evidence of brutal murders. The media coverage was intense, and we were interviewed repeatedly by journalists and documentary filmmakers. People called us heroes for bringing a killer to justice, but we did not feel like heroes. We felt sick. We had held those teeth in our hands, not knowing they had been ripped from a murdered man's mouth. We had opened that wallet and seen the face of a victim who had been missing for 51 years. I have not gone metal detecting since that day. My detector sits in my closet, unused, and I have no desire to pick it up again. Mackenzie feels the same way. She sold her equipment and found a different hobby. We still talk occasionally, but we do not discuss what happened. It is too painful, too disturbing. We wanted to find treasure, to connect with history, to uncover stories from the past. But sometimes the stories you uncover are nightmares. Sometimes the past holds horrors that should have stayed buried. Daniel Hartman's remains were finally returned to his family in Ontario, and he was given a proper burial more than 50 years after his death. His sister, who was in her 70s, attended the funeral and thanked Mackenzie and me for giving her brother closure. She said that for 5 decades her family had lived with the pain of not knowing what had happened to him, and now they finally had answers. It was a small comfort, but it did not erase the horror of what we had found. I think about Daniel Hartman sometimes. I think about how he went out to work his claim that day in 1974, probably excited about the possibility of finding gold, probably thinking about what he would do with the money if he struck it rich. And I think about how his life was cut short by a man who valued a piece of land more than a human life. And I think about the strongbox buried 4 feet underground, hidden for 51 years, waiting for someone with a metal detector to stumble across it and bring the truth to light. We were looking for treasure. We found someone's nightmare instead. I am 22 years old, and until last December, I worked as a night security guard at the McBride Museum in Whitehorse, Yukon. It was my first real job after finishing college, and while it was not glamorous, it paid decent money and allowed me to work alone, which I preferred. I was responsible for the building from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. 5 nights a week. My job was simple. Walk through the building every hour, check the doors and windows, monitor the security cameras, and make sure no one broke in. It was quiet, peaceful work, and for the first 3 months, nothing unusual ever happened. But then came the night of December 18th, and everything changed. What I experienced that night has made it impossible for me to work in security anymore, or to be alone in old buildings after dark. The McBride Museum is the oldest museum in the Yukon Territory, established in 1952. The building itself is newer than that, but the collection inside includes artifacts and exhibits dating back to the gold rush era of the 1890s and even earlier. There are displays about the indigenous peoples who lived in the Yukon for thousands of years before European contact, exhibits about the gold rush, and the prospectors who flooded into Dawson City in search of fortune. Natural history displays featuring taxidermied animals native to the region, and a special section dedicated to the Palace Grand Theater, a famous venue from the gold rush days that once hosted vaudeville shows and concerts. The museum is located in downtown Whitehorse, in an older part of the city, and at night it is surrounded by empty streets and closed businesses. When I was working there, I was usually the only person for several blocks in any direction. December in the Yukon is dark. The sun rises around 10 a.m. and sets by 4 p.m., which means that most of my shift took place in complete darkness. I did not mind this. I actually found it peaceful. I would arrive at the museum at 9:45 p.m., do a quick handoff with the evening staff who were closing up, and then lock myself inside for the night. The building had motion sensors throughout connected to a central security system that would alert me if any doors or windows were opened or if movement was detected in areas that should have been empty. I also had a set of keys that allowed me access to every room and storage area in the building. The night of December 18th started like any other. I arrived at the museum, checked in with the evening staff, and locked the front door behind me after they left. The building was quiet, heated to a comfortable temperature, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of the old structure settling and the hum of the heating system. I made my first patrol around 11 p.m., walking through each gallery and checking the exhibits. Everything was in order. The Gold Rush Gallery, with its displays of mining equipment and photographs of prospectors, was undisturbed. The natural history section, with its mounted grizzly, bear, and caribou, looked exactly as it should. The indigenous cultural exhibit, with its traditional clothing and tools, was peaceful and respectful. And the Palace Grand Theater exhibit, with its vintage costumes and memorabilia, was locked up tight. I returned to the security office, a small room near the front entrance equipped with monitors showing feeds from 8 security cameras positioned throughout the building. I sat down with my coffee and a book, planning to pass the next hour reading until it was time for my second patrol. But around midnight, one of the motion sensors went off. The alarm panel beeped, and I looked at the screen to see which sensor had been triggered. It was in the Gold Rush Gallery, near the display of mining tools and personal items from the 1890s. I watched the camera feed for that area, but I could see nothing moving. The gallery was empty, the displays undisturbed. I assumed the sensor had malfunctioned or been triggered by a draft or temperature change. It happened occasionally in old buildings. I reset the alarm and went back to my book. But 10 minutes later, the sensor went off again. Same location, same gallery. This time, I felt a flicker of unease. 2 false alarms in 10 minutes seemed unusual. I stood up and decided to do an unscheduled patrol just to be sure everything was okay. I grabbed my flashlight and walked through the building to the Gold Rush Gallery. When I arrived, everything looked normal. The display cases were locked, the artifacts inside were untouched, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. But as I stood in the gallery, scanning the room with my flashlight, I heard something that made my skin prickle. It was faint, barely audible, but it sounded like piano music. Old-fashioned piano music, the kind you might hear in a saloon or theater from the 1800s. I stood still and listened. The music was coming from somewhere deeper in the building, toward the back, where the Palace Grand Theater exhibit was located. I walked in that direction, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floors, and the music grew slightly louder. When I reached the Palace Grand exhibit, I stopped. The display was behind glass, featuring a reproduction of the theater interior with vintage furniture, costumes on mannequins, and old posters advertising shows from the Gold Rush era. And sitting in the corner of the display, clearly visible, was an old upright piano. It was part of the exhibit, placed there to give visitors a sense of what the theater might have looked like when it was operational. But the piano was just a prop. It had not been tuned or maintained in decades, and it was certainly not playable. Yet I could hear music coming from it. Or at least, I thought I could. I pressed my face against the glass and listened more carefully. The music was faint, like it was coming from far away, or from another room, but it sounded like a melody being played on that piano. A simple, repetitive tune, something melancholy and old. I tried the door to the exhibit room, but it was locked, as it should have been. I unlocked it and stepped inside, walking carefully toward the piano. As I got closer, the music stopped, just like that. One moment it was there, the next moment it was gone. I stood in front of the piano and examined it. The keys were dusty, and there was no sign that anyone had touched it. I pressed one of the keys experimentally, and it made a dull, out-of-tune sound. Definitely not the music I had just heard. I locked the exhibit room and returned to the security office, telling myself that I had been hearing things, that my mind was playing tricks on me because I was tired, or because the building was old and made strange noises. But deep down, I knew that was not what had happened. I had heard piano music, clear as day, and it had been coming from that exhibit. I sat at my desk and watched the security camera feeds more carefully. For the next hour, nothing happened. The building was silent, and the motion sensors stayed quiet. But around 1:30 a.m., I noticed something on one of the monitors. The feed from the Gold Rush gallery showed movement. One of the mannequins in the display, a prospector figure dressed in period clothing and positioned as if working at a sluice box, had moved. Its head was now turned in a different direction, facing toward the camera instead of toward the sluice box. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I'd been in that gallery less than 2 hours ago, and the mannequin had definitely been facing the other direction. I saved the footage and switched to the live feed, watching the gallery in real time. The mannequin was still in its new position, head turned toward the camera, and as I watched, I could swear I saw it shift slightly, as if adjusting its stance. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the gallery. When I arrived, the mannequin was exactly as I had seen it on camera, facing the wrong direction. But there was no way it could have moved on its own. These were not animatronic figures. They were simple display mannequins, posed and locked into position with no moving parts. I walked up to the display and examined it closely. The mannequin's head was definitely turned at an unnatural angle for the way it had been posed. Someone or something had physically moved it. I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I backed away from the display and returned to the security office, my hands shaking. I pulled up the recorded footage from the Gold Rush gallery and watched it from the beginning of my shift. For the first hour, everything was normal. Then, at exactly 12:47 a.m., just before the motion sensor had gone off, the footage showed something that made my blood run cold. A shadow moved across the gallery, passing in front of the camera. It was not a person. It was just a shadow, dark and shapeless, moving slowly and deliberately across the room. And where it passed, objects seemed to shift. The mannequin's head turned. A pick leaning against the wall tilted slightly. A pan on a shelf moved a few inches to the left. The shadow moved through the entire gallery over the course of about 30 seconds, and then it disappeared off-screen. I sat there, staring at the footage, trying to process what I was seeing. I rewound it and watched it again. The shadow was undeniable. It was not a trick of the light or a reflection. It was something moving through the gallery, interacting with the physical objects in the room. I checked the other camera feeds, and I found more evidence. In the natural history section, the camera had captured the mounted grizzly bear shifting slightly on its base, as if something had bumped into it. In the indigenous cultural exhibit, several items on display had been rearranged, not dramatically but enough to be noticeable. And in the Palace Grand Theater exhibit, the camera showed something even more disturbing. The vintage costumes on the mannequins appeared to be moving, swaying gently, as if caught in a breeze, even though the room was sealed and climate-controlled. I did not know what to do. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That shadows were moving through the museum and rearranging the displays. They would think I was crazy. I considered calling my supervisor, but it was the middle of the night, and I did not want to wake her unless there was a genuine emergency. So I stayed in the security office, watching the monitors, trying to stay calm. Around 3 a.m., the temperature in the building dropped suddenly. I could see my breath in the air, even though the heating system was still running. The monitors showed frost forming on the inside of the windows in several galleries, and the cameras in the Palace Grand Theater exhibit started to glitch, showing static and distorted images. And then I heard it again. The piano music. This time it was louder, coming from somewhere inside the building, echoing through the empty halls. It was the same melody I had heard earlier, but now it was accompanied by something else. Singing. A woman's voice, high and clear, singing an old song that I did not recognize. The voice sounded distant, like it was coming from another room or another time. I stood up and walked toward the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The music and singing were coming from the Palace Grand Theater exhibit. I could see lights flickering inside the display room, even though all the lights should have been off. I reached the exhibit room and looked through the glass. What I saw made me stop breathing. Inside the display, the mannequins were moving. Not dramatically, not like they were alive, but shifting in small, unnatural ways. Their heads turned slowly, their arms adjusted positions, and standing in the center of the room, near the piano, was the figure of a woman. She was wearing a long dress from the 1890s, her hair piled on top of her head in an elaborate style, and she was facing away from me. As I watched, she raised her hands to the piano and began to play, her fingers moving across the keys with practiced ease. The melody I had been hearing was coming from her, and she was singing, her voice filling the exhibit room with a haunting, beautiful sound. I stood there, frozen, unable to move or speak, and then slowly, the woman turned her head and looked directly at me. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark and hollow. She held my gaze for what felt like an eternity, and then she smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and then she was gone, just like that. The piano music stopped, the lights in the exhibit room went dark, and the woman vanished. The mannequins were all back in their original positions, as if nothing had happened. I ran back to the security office, grabbed my phone, and called my supervisor. I did not care what time it was. I needed to get out of that building. When she answered, I told her everything, talking so fast that I could barely get the words out. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she told me to lock myself in the security office and wait. She would come to the museum immediately. She arrived 20 minutes later, and I unlocked the front door and let her in. She walked through the building with me, checking every gallery, every exhibit. Everything looked normal. The displays were in order, the mannequins were in their correct positions, and there was no sign of anything unusual. But when we checked the security footage, it was all there, the shadow moving through the galleries, the objects being rearranged, the lights flickering in the Palace Grand Theater exhibit, and at the very end, just barely visible on the camera, the figure of a woman standing at the piano. My supervisor sat down and watched the footage 3 times. Then she turned to me and said something I will never forget. She said that I was not the first person to report strange things happening in the museum at night. Over the years, several security guards and late-night staff members had described similar experiences. Music playing from the Palace Grand exhibit, shadows moving through the galleries, objects being rearranged, the figure of a woman in period clothing. The museum had never officially acknowledged these reports because they did not want to scare employees or visitors. But everyone who worked there long enough knew that the building had a presence, something that lingered from the past and made itself known on certain nights. I quit that job the next morning. I could not go back. I could not spend another night in that building, knowing what I had seen, knowing that I might see it again. My supervisor understood, and she did not try to talk me out of it. She told me that the museum would find someone else, someone who maybe did not mind working in a haunted building. But I was done. I have not been back to the McBride Museum since that night. I drive past it sometimes, and I look at the building from the outside and I wonder if that woman is still there, playing her piano, singing her songs, waiting for someone to hear her. And I wonder if anyone will ever know who she was or why she stayed. I am 28 years old, and I work as a wilderness guide in the Yukon Territory. I have led expeditions through some of the most remote and challenging terrain in North America, from the alpine regions of the Kluane Mountains to the tundra of the far north. I have encountered bears, wolves, extreme weather, and every kind of natural hazard you can imagine. But nothing in my years of experience prepared me for what happened last February, when I was leading a group through the Rat River Valley, near the site where one of the most famous manhunts in Canadian history took place. What we experienced there cannot be explained by any rational means, and it has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. The story begins with a bit of history. In the winter of 1931 and 1932, a man known only as the Mad Trapper of Rat River led the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on a 48-day manhunt through some of the harshest terrain in the Yukon and Northwest Territories. The man, whose real identity was never definitively confirmed, shot and wounded an RCMP officer who had come to question him, and then he fled into the wilderness. What followed was an epic pursuit involving multiple officers, indigenous trackers, dog teams, and eventually even an airplane. The mad trapper traveled more than 240 kilometers through deep snow and brutal cold, evading capture with skills that seemed almost superhuman. He was finally cornered and killed in a shootout near Eagle River on February 17, 1932. To this day, the Mad Trapper remains one of the most enigmatic figures in northern Canadian history, and the area where he was killed is considered significant both historically and, according to local Indigenous communities, spiritually. Last February, I was hired to lead a 6-person expedition into the Rat River area. The clients were all experienced outdoors enthusiasts from various parts of Canada and the United States, and they had specifically requested a winter camping trip in a remote area with historical significance. The Rat River Valley fit the bill perfectly. We would be traveling through the same terrain the Mad Trapper had crossed 93 years earlier, and we would be camping in conditions similar to what he and his pursuers would have experienced. It was meant to be an adventure, a challenge, and an opportunity to connect with a fascinating piece of Northern history. We flew into Fort McPherson in the Northwest Territories on February 10th and traveled by snowmobile and dog team into the valley. The weather was typical for that time of year, -30 to -35 Celsius during the day, colder at night with occasional light snow. We set up our base camp on the second day, establishing tents and a cook shelter in a protected area near a bend in the river. The location we chose was only about 5 kilometers from where the Mad Trapper had been killed in 1932, though at the time we did not know we were that close. We had maps and GPS, but the exact site of the final shootout was not precisely marked. The first night in camp was uneventful. We cooked dinner, shared stories around the fire, and everyone settled into their tents for the night. But the next morning, one of the clients, a man named David from Ontario, came to me looking disturbed. He said he had found boot prints circling our camp. I went to look, and sure enough, there were tracks in the snow, human boot prints that circled the entire perimeter of our camp in a careful, deliberate pattern. The prints were fresh, made sometime during the night, and they were not from any of our group. We all wore modern winter boots with distinctive tread patterns, and these prints were different. They looked older, the kind of tread pattern you would see on leather boots from decades ago. I checked with everyone in the group to make sure no one had left their tent during the night. Everyone accounted for their movements, and no one had walked around the camp. I also noted that the prints started and ended at the edge of the forest, about 50 meters from our tents. There were no snowmobile tracks, no dog team tracks, no indication of how the person had arrived or left, just the boot prints circling our camp and then leading back into the trees. We spent that day exploring the area, hiking through the valley, taking photos, and discussing the history of the Mad Trapper. Several members of the group started having vivid dreams that night. They described being chased through the snow by someone they could not see, hearing gunshots echoing through the valley, and feeling an overwhelming sense of panic and fear. In the morning, 3 of the 6 clients admitted to having similar dreams, which was unusual. When people share the same nightmare themes while camping in the same location, it raises questions. On the 3rd night, things escalated. Around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of someone walking through the camp. I could hear footsteps crunching in the snow, moving slowly and deliberately between the tents. I assumed it was one of the clients heading to the designated bathroom area, so I did not get up immediately. But the footsteps continued for several minutes, walking back and forth, circling the tents. I put on my boots and headlamp and unzipped my tent. The moment I looked outside, the footsteps stopped. I shined my light around the camp and saw nothing. No one was out there. But when I stepped out and looked at the snow, I saw fresh boot prints, the same vintage style prints we had found the morning before, and they were still warm. I could see the slight melting at the edges, where whatever had made them had just passed by. I woke up two of the male clients who were experienced outdoorsmen, and we searched the area thoroughly. We found more prints leading away from the camp and into the forest. We followed them for about 100 meters, and then they simply stopped. There were no trees to climb, no rocks to jump to, nothing that would explain how a person could leave tracks that just ended in the middle of a snow-covered clearing. We stood there in the darkness, our headlamps illuminating the final prints, and none of us could come up with a rational explanation. The next morning, I made the decision that we needed to explore the area more carefully to see if there was an old cabin or structure nearby where someone might be staying. It seemed unlikely, but I had to rule out the possibility that we had a human visitor, someone who was playing a very elaborate and unsettling prank on us. We packed light day packs and hiked northwest from our camp, following the tree line along the river. After about 90 minutes of hiking, we found something that none of us had expected. It was a cabin, or the remains of one. The structure was old, very old, built from hand-hewn logs that had grayed with age. It was partially collapsed, with the roof sagging and one wall leaning inward, but it was still standing. And what was most disturbing was that there were signs of recent use. The door was ajar, and inside we could see a makeshift stove, some old cans and containers, and a sleeping area made from spruce boughs and fir. We approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was inside. There was no response. We went in and examined the interior. The stove was cold, but there were ashes in it that looked relatively fresh. The food containers were old, from the 1930s or 1940s based on their design, but the food inside was frozen and preserved. There was a rifle leaning in the corner, a vintage model that looked like it was from the 1920s or 1930s. And on a makeshift table, there was a journal. It was old, the pages yellowed and brittle, and the writing inside was faded but legible. The entries were dated from January and February of 1932. One of the clients, a woman named Sarah who had a background in history, carefully examined the journal. She read several entries aloud, and we all felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The entries described someone running from the police, traveling through the wilderness in extreme conditions and making plans to evade capture. The handwriting was consistent throughout, and the tone became increasingly paranoid and desperate as the dates progressed. The final entry was dated February 16, 1932, one day before the mad trapper was killed. We took photos of everything, but did not touch anything else. This was clearly a significant historical find, possibly the actual cabin where the mad trapper had stayed during his flight from the RCMP. But what disturbed us was the evidence of recent activity. Someone had been in this cabin recently. The ashes in the stove, the arrangement of the sleeping area, the position of the rifle, all of it suggested that someone had been living here within the past few weeks or months. But that should have been impossible. The cabin was not marked on any map, and there was no indication that anyone knew of its existence. We returned to camp, and I used my satellite phone to contact the RCMP in Fort McPherson. I reported what we had found and gave them the GPS coordinates of the cabin. They thanked me for the information and said they would send officers to investigate when weather permitted. But they also told me something that made my blood run cold. They said that several groups over the years had reported finding old cabins in that area, cabins that showed signs of recent use. But when officers arrived to investigate, the cabins were either gone or showed no evidence of recent activity. They suggested that the harsh conditions and the isolation of the area could cause people to misinterpret what they were seeing. That night, we heard the rifle shot. It was around 2 a.m., and it echoed through the valley, a single sharp crack that sounded exactly like a gunshot from a vintage rifle. Everyone in the camp was awakened by it, and we all heard it clearly. I immediately checked to make sure everyone in our group was accounted for and that no one had discharged a weapon. Everyone was in their tents, and none of us had firearms with us except for a single shotgun I carried for bear protection, which was still secured in my tent. The next morning, one of the clients, a man named Greg, found something that made us all decide we needed to leave immediately. About 200 meters from our camp, in the direction from which the gunshot had come, he found a figure standing on a ridgeline. At first, he thought it was one of us, and he started walking toward it to see who was up there. But as he got closer, he realized it was not anyone from our group. It was a man wearing old-style winter clothing, fur and leather, and he was standing completely still, watching our camp. Greg stopped and called out, asking if the man needed help. The figure did not respond. Greg waved, and the figure slowly raised one arm, not in a wave, but in a gesture that seemed to be pointing back toward our camp. And then, according to Greg, the figure simply faded. It did not walk away or run. It just became less solid, less visible, until it was gone. Greg came back to camp pale and shaking, and he described what he had seen. I believed him. Everything that had happened over the past few days had been leading to something like this, and Greg was not the type of person to make up stories or hallucinate. We held a group meeting, and I gave everyone the option of leaving immediately or staying to complete the expedition. 5 of the 6 clients voted to leave. Only one person, a woman named Lisa, who had a strong interest in paranormal phenomena, wanted to stay. But I made the executive decision that we would evacuate. As a guide, my primary responsibility was the safety of my clients, and I could not ignore the fact that we were all experiencing something that defied explanation and was causing significant psychological distress. We packed up the camp and hiked back to the pickup point where we had left the snowmobiles. The entire time I felt like we were being watched, like someone or something was following us through the trees. We made it back to Fort McPherson without incident, and the clients flew out the next day. Before I left, I spoke with an elder from the Gwich'in community, a man named James who had lived in the area his entire life. I told him what we had experienced, and he was not surprised. He said that the Rat River Valley was known to be a place where spirits lingered, particularly in the area where violent deaths had occurred. He said that the Mad Trapper's spirit was believed to still be in that area, still running, still evading capture, reliving the final days of his life over and over. He told me that the Gwich'in people avoided that part of the valley during the winter, especially around the anniversary of the Mad Trapper's death in mid-February. The RCMP did send officers to investigate the cabin we had found. When they arrived at the GPS coordinates I had provided, they found the structure, but it was completely collapsed and showed no signs of recent use. The stove was rusted through, the sleeping area was buried under debris, and there was no journal, no rifle, and no evidence that anyone had been there in decades. The photos we had taken showed the cabin as we had seen it, but the officers said the structure they found did not match our photos. They concluded that we had either found a different cabin, or that the harsh conditions and the stress of the situation had caused us to misperceive what we were seeing. I no longer lead expeditions in the Rat River Valley. I have plenty of other areas where I can take clients for wilderness experiences, and I have no desire to return to that place. The Mad Trapper died there in 1932, but I do not think he ever really left. And I do not think the cabin we found was an old ruin. I think it was something else, something that exists in a space between past and present. A place where the events of February 1932 are still happening, still playing out, forever frozen in time. Some places hold on to their history, and some people, even after death, refuse to stop running.